Elias Corvino was marrying her because of a promise his grandfather made, not because he wanted to sign the papers, share a roof, and in 2 years, hand her back her freedom with a check large enough that nobody would ask anything further. He had it all worked out, until the morning before the light came. When he got home and saw the lamps still on in the north wing, the place he hadn't set foot in for 3 years. The door stood half open, and he stopped. Inside, the woman he was about to marry sat on a low chair pulled close to the bed, sleeves rolled to the elbow, feeding his mother a third of a spoon at a time. The woman who had once held every ledger this family owned, who had once made men with guns take their hats off at the door, and who now could not keep her own son's name in her head for more than a few dozen breaths. She lifted the spoon, waited, counted under her breath, then fed her, and when his mother let some of it fall on her chin, she wiped it away without breaking off the story she was telling. Something about the neighbor's dog that kept getting through the fence, a story going nowhere, and his mother never answered a word, never knew who she was, and she kept telling it anyway. Elias stood out in the dark hallway with his keys still in his hand until the bowl was empty, long enough that beyond the window the sky had begun to turn gray, and in all that time she never once looked toward the door, never once did the thing he had watched dozens of people in that house do for 3 years. Glance toward wherever the powerful man was standing, to be sure someone had seen the work she didn't know he was there. She did it when no one was watching. That morning he stood in the dark hallway and made a decision he told no one about, and when his lawyer later asked why he was going through with an arrangement he had once fought so hard against, Elias Corvino was quiet a long moment and said, "Because I've just realized she is the only person in this house who actually wants my mother to live." What he did not know was that she had not wandered through that door by chance. Someone had put her there, and had waited 3 years for her to come, that the gray wool coat his mother wouldn't let anyone hang in a closet, the hem she smoothed dozens of times a day, the habit everyone had written off as a broken mind repeating itself, had never once been meaningless, and that the night he had spent 3 years condemning himself for was no accident at all. The man who caused it was still eating at the long table in his dining room, still calling him son, and was the same man who had taught him to knot his first necktie. If this story reached you, leave a like, a comment, share it with whoever just came to mind, and subscribe to our channel for the stories still to come. Dinner at Barrow Point always began later than people expected, because in that house no one sat down before the master of the house did, and the master had a habit of standing for a while at the gable window before entering the dining room, looking out over the yard gone bare with the season and the lamps along the driveway, 2 of which had burned out the previous winter and still hadn't been replaced. The long table in the center of the room was an old one, dark oak, so long that whoever sat at one end had to lean slightly forward to hear clearly what was being said at the other, and that evening 9 men were seated around it. 8 of them knew exactly why they'd been invited. The 9th believed he knew. Marin Doyle stood in the dimness beyond the hallway, holding a tray of clean towels Estelle had asked her to bring downstairs, and she'd meant to turn away at once. She simply didn't turn quickly enough. The main course was served, then cleared away, and through all of it Elias Corvino said almost nothing. He listened. He let other people finish speaking before asking about one small detail buried in the middle of what they'd said, the detail the speaker had assumed no one would notice, and each time he did, the man answering would hesitate for the smallest beat before replying. When the coffee came, Elias turned toward the man seated 3 chairs away from him, a salt and pepper-haired man wearing a crew-neck sweater beneath his jacket, with a wedding ring on his left hand so old that it had sunk into the flesh around his finger. He asked, after the man's daughter. He asked what she was studying at that school, and the man said architecture, his voice softening at once in the way any father's voice might soften when someone asked about his child. Elias nodded. He said architecture was a good field, that it took a long time, but it was good. Then he reached beneath the table, took out a thin envelope, so thin that anyone looking at it could tell there was no money inside, and slid it across the polished wood over the distance of 3 chairs, not quickly, not forcefully, just enough for it to stop precisely beside the other man's coffee saucer. Then he said that the man's car was already waiting outside. No one in the room moved. The man looked at the envelope. He didn't open it. Perhaps he didn't need to. He looked up, parted his lips, and for a moment something very much like hope passed across his face. The hope of a man who still believed that anything could be explained, if people were only willing to sit down and listen. But Elias was no longer looking at him. He had already turned to the man on his right, and asked about the shipment at Pier 7, using the same voice he would have used to ask about the weather. And the other man answered, and the conversation went on. No one rose and walked around the table. No one put a hand on anyone's shoulder. No door was slammed shut. The man stood up on his own. He folded his napkin and placed it carefully to the left of his plate, as though carefulness might still be of some use to him somewhere. He picked up the envelope. He walked out, and Marin heard the sound of his shoes crossing the marble floor of the foyer, slowing near the door, then moving again. Outside came the sound of a car door closing, then tires grinding over gravel, and then there was nothing. In the dining room, the men were discussing oil prices and a bridge being repaired to the south. For the rest of the meal, no one mentioned the man's name again. It wasn't because they were afraid to say it. It was because, in that house, the name had just ceased to exist, and every one of them understood that at the same moment. Marin carried the tray of towels down to the kitchen and stood there for a while with both hands resting on the edge of the stone counter, until she realized they had stopped trembling. Walt Prosser was pouring coffee from the large pot into a smaller one, using both hands, and moving slowly because the joints in his fingers had swollen and twisted out of shape over several winters, and evenings were always worse than afternoons. He didn't ask what she'd seen. He simply set the coffee pot down, wiped his hands on a towel, and answered the question she hadn't spoken aloud. The old man used to pound the table, Walt said. The whole house heard it. The whole yard heard it. And once the cook dropped an entire tray of glasses. His father cursed. He cursed very well, cursed in 3 languages, and people left with their ears still ringing. Walt lifted the smaller coffee pot and held it beneath the light to see whether it was full enough, then continued in the same even voice he might have used to talk about rain. But this one just looks at you. Marin said nothing. Walt picked up the tray and passed her, stopping for a moment in the doorway. 3 men who've sat across from him at that table, he said, don't live in this city anymore. Then he went upstairs. Marin remained in the brightly lit kitchen, listening to the voices and laughter drifting down from the dining room. The ordinary laughter of well-fed men talking business, and she thought about the man who had folded his napkin and placed it to the left of his plate before walking out. She thought about the daughter studying architecture somewhere, probably still awake tonight, drawing, knowing nothing at all. Then Marin washed her hands, dried them, and went up to the north wing, where a woman was waiting for her late dinner without knowing that she was waiting. Harold Ledbetter's office was on the 19th floor of an old building on LaSalle Street, the kind of building where the elevator still had an iron lattice gate and someone still had to pull it shut by hand. And Elias went there that morning without an appointment, sat down in a leather chair with cracked armrests, and said he wanted to stop the 2-year arrangement. Ledbetter was 70 years old, had worked for 3 generations of the Corvino family, and had acquired the habit common to men who had practiced their profession too long, which was never to ask why before asking when. He simply took off his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, then rose and walked to the filing cabinet in the corner, the one Elias had seen dozens of times and had never once seen opened. He took out a brown hardbound file, set it on the desk, and said that perhaps Elias ought to hear this part again, because on the day he signed the inheritance papers, he had buried his father only 3 weeks earlier and had signed 28 signatures in a single afternoon, and Ledbetter knew for certain that he hadn't read this section. Then he read it aloud. He read slowly, in a dry, uninflected voice, the kind of voice people use when reading something they already know is going to hurt the person listening. The heir must enter into a lawful marriage before the specified deadline. If he fails to do so, the trust shall be closed permanently. All real property held under the family name shall be offered for sale, and the proceeds shall be divided equally among the remaining beneficiaries, according to the attached schedule. Ledbetter finished reading, closed the file, and said nothing more. He let the room do its work. Outside the window came the sound of the elevated train passing by, that familiar metallic shriek of the city, and Elias sat still, staring at the filing cabinet in the corner. He asked what would happen to the house. Ledbetter said the house was listed in the first category. Elias asked what would happen to everything inside the house. Ledbetter said everything inside the house was also listed in the first category, and he said it in the voice of a man who understood what the real question was. Elias asked nothing else. He thanked him, stood, and when he reached the door, he stopped with one hand resting on the brass knob worn smooth by years of use, and he stood there long enough for Ledbetter to say that he was very sorry, and he meant it. He truly was sorry. 3 hours later, Elias was sitting in the car in the underground garage without telling Walt to start the engine. Walt didn't ask any questions either. He sat behind the wheel, with both hands resting on his thighs, and waited, because he'd been driving members of this family for nearly 50 years, and he knew there were mornings when a man needed the basement more than he needed the road. The cruelly funny thing, and Elias knew it was funny in the kind of way no one could laugh at, was that it had taken him exactly one night to understand that he didn't want to use that woman like a piece of paper, and exactly one morning to understand that he had no choice but to use her like a piece of paper, because otherwise the woman at the end of the North Wing corridor would lose her room, lose the window that looked out toward the trees, lose the bed she'd lain in for 3 years, the one thing left in the world that still felt familiar to her. The contract was placed in Marin's hands the following afternoon, inside a thick envelope on the table in the small sitting room, with a pen someone had thoughtfully set beside it. She didn't pick up the pen right away. She pulled out a chair, sat down, and read the way she would read the medical chart of a newly admitted patient, starting from the very first line, skipping none of the defined terms, skipping none of the fine print in the footnotes, and every few lines stopping to turn back and compare what she had just read with something earlier in the document. She read all 31 pages in a little more than an hour. She underlined 3 passages with her fingernail instead of the pen, the habit of someone accustomed to working with papers that didn't belong to her. A term of 2 years, 2 separate floors, separate daily lives, no obligations beyond those required for legal purposes, and a single lump sum payment at the end. She read the amount and didn't linger over it any longer than she had over any of the other lines. By the time Elias came in, she'd finished and was straightening the pages so their edges aligned. She didn't ask about the money. She didn't ask what she would be called in this house, where she would sit at dinner, or what she would be expected to say to outsiders. She didn't ask why he'd chosen her, even though that was the question for which he'd prepared 3 different answers on the way upstairs. She looked up and asked only one thing. During those 2 years, where would his mother be? He said at home. She looked at him for another moment, perhaps to make certain he wasn't simply saying whatever was necessary to get through the conversation. Then she lowered her eyes, picked up the pen someone had left ready for her, and signed. She signed the way she would sign a physician's order, neat and without flourish, the date beneath it, her handwriting clear enough to be read from the far end of the table. Then she pushed the papers back toward him, stood, said she had to go warm up his mother's dinner, and left the room. Elias remained there alone with 31 pages of paper and a pen that was still warm from her hand, and he stood there for a very long time, understanding that he had just lost something. He simply didn't yet know what to call it. The notice board beside the kitchen door was a framed sheet of cork that had hung there since the old man's time, and in this house, people still pinned things to it exactly the way they had for 50 years. Duty rosters, supply orders, furnace repair notices, the plumber's phone number. The sheet of paper had been pinned up that morning, when Marin came down to the kitchen for hot water, and she noticed it at once, because it was different. There was an embossed logo at the top of the page, the paper itself thicker than ordinary paper, the kind people used only when they wanted a piece of paper to look like a decision. The heading was printed in bold and spoke of streamlining operating expenses. Beneath it were 9 numbered items, each 2 or 3 lines long, written in that kind of language where no human being seemed to exist at all, the kind that left you unable to be angry at anyone once you had finished reading it. The first item concerned the cancellation of the groundskeeping contract. The third concerned the sale of 2 cars from the garage. The 5th concerned reducing the girl from town to 1 shift a week. And the 7th sat near the middle of the page, no bolder than any other, marked by nothing at all, simply one item among 9, stating that Mrs. A. Corvino would be transferred to a long-term nursing facility before the end of the month, because the cost of home care could no longer be sustained, and that transportation arrangements would be handled by the office. At the bottom of the page was Arthur Mercer's signature, handwritten, slanting, elegant, the signature of a man who had signed thousands of things in his life, and no longer had to think about doing it. Marin read all 9 items. She read the 7th a second time, then a third, and through all of it she was still holding the spoon in her right hand, the spoon she had just used to stir the pot on the stove, and she only realized she was still holding it when she saw a drop fall onto the toe of her shoe. Walt came into the kitchen, saw her standing there, and he didn't need to look at the paper to know what she was reading. He went to the sink, turned on the water, and began washing the 2 coffee pots from the night before, doing it slowly because mornings were always the worst time for his hands. Marin asked him how much time was left. Walt didn't answer. He finished washing the first pot, turned it upside down on the rack, and looked out the window toward the yard, where a few iron chairs sat unused for the season, and a drained fountain had been covered with a tarp since autumn. He looked out there for a long while, then began washing the second pot. That night Marin sat on the bed in her room on the 3rd floor, opened her computer, and did the thing she had done at the end of every month for the past 4 years. She opened the spreadsheet. She added everything up again, the money left in her account, the money she had set aside and promised herself she wouldn't touch. The remaining hospital debt from when her father died, nearly paid off, but not completely. Owen's first-year tuition, the number sitting in its own colored cell, a number she had looked at so many times that she could see it without looking. She added, then subtracted, then added everything again. Not because she was afraid she had made a mistake, but because a calculation you wanted to come out differently was the kind of calculation a person ought to do twice. It came out the same. She sat still for a while with the bright screen glowing in the dark room, and she knew exactly what she was about to trade away, and exactly what she was trading it for, and she knew that the woman at the end of the North Wing corridor would never know any of this, would never thank her, would never remember her name for more than a few dozen breaths at a time. She closed the computer. The next morning, she took the bus out to the supermarket on the main road, bought 4 cartons of concentrated nutritional supplement and 2 containers of thickening powder made for people who had difficulty swallowing, paid with her own card, asked for the receipt, folded it in half, and slipped it into her coat pocket. When she got back to the house, she went upstairs, took the hardbound notebook from the drawer, turned to a fresh page, drew 3 columns with a ruler, and wrote the first line. He came down to the kitchen before dawn, and Marin heard his footsteps before she saw him, because in this house anyone walking the lower hallway at that hour could be heard, and she had grown used to 2 kinds of footsteps. Walt's were heavy and even. Estelle's were short and quick. These belonged to neither. He stopped in the kitchen doorway wearing a white shirt without cufflinks, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he said nothing. She didn't ask anything either. She was blending the morning porridge, and she simply kept working, measuring the thickening powder with a level spoon instead of guessing, stirring, letting it sit long enough to thicken, then testing the consistency by lifting the spoon and watching whether the porridge fell in one continuous ribbon or in separate drops. When she poured it into a bowl and set the bowl on the tray, he stepped forward and picked up the tray. She let him take it. She followed him down the North Wing corridor at a measured distance, and when they reached the bedroom door, she stopped. Inside, the lamp in the corner was still set to the same dim level it was every night, and Adelaide was already awake, sitting propped against the pillows with both hands resting on the blanket, her eyes turned toward the window where the morning light had not yet begun. Elias set the tray on the small table. He pulled the chair closer, sat on the edge of the bed to her right, and picked up the spoon. He did everything slowly. He filled the spoon, leaned toward her, and brought it up from directly in front of her face. What happened next was very fast. She jerked backward, threw up her arm, and knocked the spoon from his hand. Porridge spilled across the blanket, down the sleeve of his white shirt, and onto the floor. She pulled the blanket up to her chest, pressed herself into the corner of the bed against the wall, and began to cry. Not with the cry of a 62-year-old woman, but with the cry of a child awakened in the middle of the night, crying aloud, hiding nothing, holding nothing back, because a stranger had just reached a hand toward her face. Elias stood, stepped backward once, then again, and remained there with both hands suspended in front of his chest, like a man who had just dropped something precious and already knew it couldn't be picked up again. Then he sat down on the floor. He didn't sit in the chair. He lowered himself all the way onto the wooden floor, leaned his back against the side of the bed, rested both hands on his knees, bowed his head slightly, and couldn't say a single word. Marin came in. She didn't look at him. She didn't pause for even a second where he sat. She walked around to the left side of the bed, lowered herself into a seat, and began talking in her ordinary voice, only a little louder than usual, telling Adelaide about how the neighbors had just repainted their gate and the paint hadn't even dried before the dog managed to rub itself against it. A story that didn't lead anywhere at all. She rested her hand on the back of Adelaide's hand. She didn't hold it. She simply placed it there. She sat that way and kept talking until Adelaide's breathing slowed, until she stopped clutching the blanket, until her fingers loosened from its edge and began smoothing the hem of the gray wool cardigan draped over the back of the chair beside her. The motion she made dozens of times every day, and no one in the house noticed anymore. Then Marin stood, fetched a towel, cleaned the spilled porridge from the blanket, changed the pillowcase, and carried the broken bowl outside. When she returned, Elias was still sitting in exactly the same place on the floor. She knelt down until she was level with him, sat back on her heels, and spoke softly in the same voice she used when handing over a shift to a new nurse. "Don't come at her from the front," she said. "She has already lost half of the visual field on her right side. Anything you bring toward her from the middle of her face seems to appear out of nowhere, so it frightens her. Come in from the left, slowly, and let her see your hand before your hand gets close. Don't stand. When you stand, you're taller than she is, and people don't like eating when someone is standing over them. Sit at her eye level, A little lower is fine too. Bring the spoon up at chin level, not nose level. Wait until she opens her mouth first. Don't touch her lips to make her open them. She paused for a moment, then continued. And keep talking. Talk about anything. The weather, traffic, anything at all. She doesn't understand the content. She only hears the voice. Elias didn't ask a single question. He looked at the streak of porridge still clinging to his sleeve, and he gave one very small nod. Then he stood, walked out, and went straight into the yard without eating breakfast and without taking a coat. He walked all the way to the iron chairs that had been left out past the season and stood there until full daylight came. Walt saw him from the window above the garage and didn't go down. The next morning, when Marin came into the kitchen, the lights were already on, and Elias was standing there with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, asking whether it was 2 spoonfuls or 3 spoonfuls of thickening powder. 6 weeks passed in the way time always passes in large houses that have run out of money, which is to say no one announced anything. It simply reached a point when everyone was following a new order without being able to remember exactly which day it had begun. Marin cooked. Elias carried the food in. Walt stood in the doorway with both hands in his pockets and talked about the weather, about how the wind was changing direction, about how the crows were gathering on the garage roof earlier than they had in other years, and he said these things with the steady regularity of someone turning on a radio just to make a room feel less empty, and no one ever told him to stop. The other two talked because 2 people couldn't stand beside each other that long every morning and remain silent forever. But they spoke only about whatever was directly in front of them, about how the porridge was a little too thin that day, about the hinge on the bedroom door needing oil, about whether the low chair should be moved half a handspan farther to the left, and then, from those things directly in front of them, a small piece of something farther away would sometimes fall loose. He learned that her grandfather had driven for his grandfather for many years, and that he had died on a winter night while delivering an envelope, and that in her family they still called it an accident, and she said this in exactly the same voice she used when talking about the price of thickening powder. She learned that the woman lying in the room beyond them had kept every set of books for this family for 26 years, that she'd done it with pen and paper rather than a machine, that she wrote the number 7 with a line through the middle, the way people had been taught when she was a girl, and that in 26 years, she had never been off by a single cent, not because she was better at figures than everyone else, but because she added everything 3 times every evening before closing the books. Elias told her that one morning while standing beside the small table with a cloth in his hand, and when the story was finished, he stopped. He added nothing more. Then, one morning, Marin brought into the room a sewing basket she'd borrowed from Estelle, along with a needle, a spool of white thread, and a scrap of cloth. She placed them on the blanket in front of Adelaide, gave no instructions, didn't urge her to do anything, simply set them there, moved back, and began talking about something involving the crows on the garage roof. Adelaide stared at the needle for a long time. She didn't know where she was. She didn't remember the name of the woman sitting beside her, didn't remember whose house this was, didn't remember what season it was. Then she picked up the needle between 2 fingers of her right hand, raised the spool of thread to eye level, wet the end of the thread with her tongue, twisted it between her fingertips, and passed it through the eye of the needle on the very first try. Then she picked up the cloth, folded the edge, and began to sew. A basting stitch, each stitch evenly spaced, so even that a ruler laid across them would have found no variation, and her hand moved back and forth over the cloth, with the rhythm of someone who had done the same thing thousands of times and no longer needed to think about it. Elias was standing in the doorway. No one knew how long he'd been there, one hand still holding the empty tray, and he didn't come into the room. Marin saw him, and without turning her head, she spoke just loudly enough for him to hear. "Some parts of memory don't live in the head," she said. "They live in the hands. It's called procedural memory, and it's stored in a different part of the brain from the part that holds people's names and faces. So when that other part is damaged, this one can remain." She looked at the hand moving through its stitches. "A person can forget everything," she said, "except the things the body has done thousands of times. She doesn't remember what she's sewing, and 10 minutes from now she won't remember that she sewed it. But her hands remember." Elias said nothing for a long while. Then he asked quietly what else she might still remember. Marin didn't answer at once. She watched Adelaide's hand finish an entire line of stitching, then said she didn't know yet. Adelaide finished the piece of cloth, set it down on the blanket, reached toward the back of the chair beside her, and smoothed the hem of the gray wool cardigan, then lifted her eyes toward the window, as though there were no one else in the room. That week they began repairing the main corridor near the study, where the wooden floor had rotted beneath the window that was always leaking, and the workers stretched tarps across the passage from early morning, so anyone coming in through the front door and trying to reach the dining room had to go around through the north wing. That afternoon was warmer than usual, and Marin had left the bedroom door slightly open for air. The door opened inward, barely a handspan, just enough for sounds from the hallway to carry inside. Adelaide was eating. Lunch was always easier than breakfast. She was sitting upright, her left hand resting on the blanket, and Marin was telling some story about the neighbor's gate when footsteps sounded outside. They weren't Walt's shoes. They weren't the workers' shoes. They were leather soles against the wooden floor, even and unhurried. The footsteps of a man walking through a house he had been walking through for 40 years. Marin didn't turn toward the door. She was watching Adelaide, and because of that, she saw everything. Adelaide stopped chewing. The spoon in her hand fell onto the blanket, not because it was knocked away, but because she let it go. Her fingers simply opened and stopped holding it. Then she moved backward. She pushed herself toward the corner of the bed against the wall, both heels dragging across the mattress, and pressed her entire body into that corner as though there were a second wall inside the room that no one else could see. Her hands reached for the gray wool cardigan draped over the back of the chair, pulled it into her lap, and clutched the hem with all 10 fingers, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She didn't cry out. She didn't weep. She simply held her breath and stared toward the partly open door, and that was what sent a chill down Marin's spine, because in the 3 months she'd been in this house, she'd never once seen that woman look toward anything with such deliberate purpose. In the hallway, the man passed the doorway. He didn't turn his head toward the room. He didn't slow down. He walked straight on, carrying a leather briefcase in his right hand, and a moment later the dining room door closed at the far end of the corridor. It took Marin a very long time to bring Adelaide out of that corner. She didn't pull her. She sat down low on the left side, leaving her hand resting on the blanket some distance from Adelaide's, and she talked. She talked continuously, about anything at all, about the crows, about the hinge that needed oil, about how the wind tended to slip through the window frame this time of year. Adelaide didn't answer with a single sound. It wasn't until much later, after the sound of a car leaving over the gravel drive had faded outside, that she loosened her grip on the cardigan, and her hand began smoothing the hem again in that old familiar rhythm, and she lifted her eyes toward the window. The unfinished lunch remained untouched on the tray. That evening, Marin opened the hardbound notebook and wrote in the middle column as she did every day: lunch, amount eaten, time, and then on the line beneath everything else she added a sentence that belonged to none of the columns, that today Adelaide had been afraid of something. And Marin stared at those words for a while before closing the notebook, because she didn't understand them, and she wasn't someone who wrote down things she didn't understand. 3 days later, in the afternoon, Milo Briggs came over with his mother, Delia Nolan's widow, and discovered that the greenhouse out back was the warmest place on the entire property at that hour. The boy was 8 years old, wearing a red knit cap and carrying a comic book folded in half inside his coat pocket, and he sat down flat on the tiled floor beside the wicker chair where Adelaide was sitting, stretched out his legs, opened the comic book, and began reading aloud. He read with great seriousness. He gave every character a different voice, a deep voice for the mayor, a shrill one for the parrot. And when he reached the part where the parrot repeated the mayor's words backward, he switched voices so quickly that even he had to stop to catch his breath. Walt stood in the greenhouse doorway holding a watering can and said nothing. The afternoon sunlight passed through the glass, clouded with condensation, and fell across the floor in bright squares. Adelaide didn't understand a single word. She looked at the red knit cap, looked at the 2 small hands holding the comic book, and when the boy changed voices for the 3rd time, she laughed. One short, rough sound that seemed to surprise even her. Milo looked up, saw her reaction, was deeply pleased with himself, and read that exact passage again. The name Calumet was spoken in the house for the first time one morning in the kitchen, when Walt mentioned that the young master would be going down there after lunch and would probably be back late, and Marin didn't ask where Calumet was because she assumed it was the name of a road or some freight yard somewhere to the south. And in this house, life was easier when you asked fewer questions. He went down there alone. More precisely, Walt drove him to the end of the road, then shut off the engine and waited there as instructed, while Elias walked the final stretch, past a rusted iron gate, across a parking lot full of puddles filmed with oil, and into the warehouse. There were 11 people inside. They already knew he was coming, because in that line of work people always knew half an hour in advance, and they had arranged themselves in the way people did when they wanted a man walking in to feel outnumbered. No one greeted him. An exhaust fan turned steadily overhead. Water dripped somewhere in a corner, and the smell of machine oil mingled with damp cardboard. Elias didn't look around. He walked straight to the steel drum sitting in the middle of the aisle, the kind of thing people used as a table in places like that, and laid a stapled packet of papers on top. He opened it. He didn't offer a greeting, didn't say anyone's name, didn't mention the money, didn't mention the previous month. He turned to the first page and said that this was a list of their vehicles, the license plates, the model years, and where they kept them overnight. He turned to the second page and said that this was a list of their homes, the street numbers, the street names, and the names appearing on the deeds, because 4 of the men in that room didn't hold their properties in their own names. He turned to the third page. He rested his hand on it for a moment before speaking, and he said that this was a list of the people who had lent them money the year before. Then he added 4 words. "They're all my friends." No one said anything. The man standing closest to the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other. At the far end of the warehouse, a younger man was holding a phone, and he slipped it into his pocket, not because he intended to do anything, only because he wanted both hands empty. Elias closed the packet, tucked it beneath his arm, and said they had until the end of the week. Then he turned his back on them. He walked out slowly, passing between 11 men who stood without moving, looking at no one, never quickening his pace near the end, and not once glancing behind him. Someone opened the door for him. Elias didn't look at that man either. Outside, evening was beginning to fall, and Walt was waiting at the end of the road with the headlights already on. On the drive home, neither of them spoke until they were across the bridge. Then Walt asked whether there was anything he needed him to do, and Elias said no, and they traveled the rest of the way in silence. 3 days later, the warehouse operation shut down. There was no announcement. It was simply that by Monday morning the gate was closed. The 2 trucks that had still been parked in the yard the week before were gone, and the company's sign on the wall had been removed, leaving 4 screw holes behind. The bank called first, then the warehouse landlord, then 2 of the people whose names appeared on the third page, and everything was settled in 3 phone calls. No one was hurt. No one had to go to the hospital. No one had to change a phone number, and there wasn't a sound. That evening, Marin heard Walt tell the story in the kitchen, briefly, in the way someone might describe a passing rainstorm, and she realized that she wasn't afraid of the warehouse, and she wasn't afraid of the 11 men standing inside it. She was afraid of those 3 stapled pages, and of the calmness of the man who had sat down and prepared them. Walt told her the story one afternoon while standing in the garage doorway in broad daylight, wiping a wrench with a rag even though the wrench was already clean, and he told it in roughly 200 words, because that was all he intended to say about it for the rest of his life. His name was Nolan Briggs, Walt said. Drove for the young master for 4 years. Good at the job, always on time, didn't drink, didn't talk much. Had exactly one bad habit, though. Nobody could tell him anything. Give him an order he thought was wrong, and he'd carry it out exactly as instructed, then spend the next 2 weeks explaining to you why you were wrong. Walt stopped and folded the rag. That afternoon, he said, the lady of the house had a follow-up appointment in the city. The young master had a meeting he couldn't move, so he gave Nolan the keys to his own car. The car came back, Walt said, and he said those words very slowly. She did too. He didn't. Then Walt tucked the rag into his back pocket and finished the story by saying that for the past 3 years, money had been transferred into Nolan's wife's account every single month, regular as clockwork, not 1 month missed, and that the young master had never once gone the half-mile down that road. Then he went inside, and the story ended there. The rain came not long afterward, a late-season storm that had been falling since the afternoon, and by evening the gutter at the east gable had torn loose from its bracket, sending water straight down onto the steps in a white column. Marin went out first with a bucket and a flashlight, climbed the folding ladder Walt kept beside the greenhouse, and when she looked up, Elias was already standing at the other end of it, soaked through, one hand holding the bracket in place. It took them about half an hour to secure it temporarily with wire. Then they both ran into the garage because the rain was blowing sideways, and neither of them wanted to circle around to the front entrance. The garage was dry and dark, smelling of machine oil, rubber, and damp concrete, with a single light still burning at the far end of the ceiling. 7 cars sat beneath covers. 6 of the covers were folded neatly at all 4 corners, cords threaded through and tied tight, exactly the way a careful mechanic would cover a car. The 7th wasn't. Its cover had simply been pulled over the roof and allowed to fall where it would, one corner touching the floor, another hanging crooked, and a layer of dust lay so thick across the fabric that you could still see the handprint of the person who had covered it 3 years earlier and never come back. Marin had asked Walt about that car during her first week and had received only a short answer. "Don't touch that one." Now she stood wringing the water from her hair, and she saw Elias looking at it. He didn't look for long. He turned away, leaned against the workbench, and spoke without looking at her. He said he'd always thought the worst part was that afternoon, that decision, those keys. But it wasn't. He said the worst part was the 3 years that followed. There was a payment that went out on the 5th of every month, and he didn't have to do anything at all. Didn't have to sign anything. Didn't have to remember anything. Only had to leave the automatic transfer in place. And every time it went through, something inside his mind seemed to close a little further. He said he'd flown to the East Coast twice that year, had sat for 4 hours in a room listening to people ask how much the land belonging to his family could be sold for, and he still hadn't gone the half-mile down that road. Marin asked why. She asked him directly, without softening the question, because during the month she'd spent standing beside him every morning, she'd learned that he couldn't bear gentleness. He was silent for a while. Then he said, "Because she'll forgive me, and I don't know what to do with that." Rain hammered against the garage door. Marin set the flashlight down on the workbench, leaving its beam pointed toward the ceiling, and said that in that case, he shouldn't bring money anymore. "Bring them something that needs doing," she said. "The porch roof, the fence, the window that won't close when the wind comes. Go there, do the work, then leave. People will forgive you while your back is turned and both your hands are busy, not while 2 people sit facing each other and stare down at a table." She picked up the bucket. "That's the only way people know how to receive it," she said. Elias turned his head and looked at her. Then he laughed, once, low and brief, the sound escaping him before he meant for it to, and it was the first time in 3 months that she'd heard that sound anywhere in the house. The main corridor remained under repair for another half-month, and during that time Arthur Mercer came to the house once more, taking the long way around through the north wing just as he had before, and the woman in the room reacted exactly as she had the first time, without a single detail changed, even down to the way she released the spoon instead of dropping it. That evening, Marin opened the hardbound notebook and turned back through the pages. She found the sentence she had written several weeks earlier at the bottom of a page, the sentence that belonged to none of the columns, and she held her finger there while turning forward to that day's page, where she wrote another line exactly like it. 2 lines, 19 days apart. Then she sat for a very long time with the notebook open on her lap. She was accustomed to working with things that repeated themselves, because in her profession, a symptom that happened once could be ordinary, but the same symptom happening twice under the same circumstances was no longer ordinary. She thought about those 2 afternoons and began eliminating possibilities one by one. It wasn't the noise, because the workers hadn't been there that day. It wasn't the light, because one afternoon had been warm and bright, while the other was gray. It wasn't the presence of a stranger, because strangers came through the house every week. Electricians, delivery men, the girl from town. Only one thing had been exactly the same both times, and there was one other thing Marin had looked at hundreds of times, without ever truly seeing. She raised her eyes to the gray wool cardigan draped over the back of the chair. During her 3 months in the house, she had regarded it as an object of illness, the kind of anchor people like Adelaide held onto, and in her handover notes, she had written that the patient had an attachment object that should remain in its usual place. Now she thought again about the way Adelaide pulled it into her lap when she was frightened, and about how she never touched the sleeves or the collar, but always stroked the same exact place, the lower hem on the left front side, rubbing it back and forth with the pad of her thumb dozens of times a day, for 3 years. The next morning, after Adelaide had fallen asleep again following breakfast, Marin carried the cardigan to the small table beside the window, switched on the desk lamp, and turned the lining inside out. The hem had been sewn by hand. She recognized it immediately, because the rest of the garment had been machine-stitched, with the perfectly uniform stitches of a machine, while this section alone had been done by hand, and whoever had sewn it wasn't clumsy. The stitches were evenly spaced, the same basting stitch Marin had watched Adelaide make on the scrap of cloth days earlier. She took the small scissors from the sewing box she'd borrowed from Estelle. She didn't cut the thread. She found the knot at the beginning of the seam, loosened it with the tip of the scissors, then drew the thread out little by little, slowly, with the same care someone might use to remove a splinter from a child's hand, because she didn't yet know what was inside, and she didn't want to damage something she didn't understand. When the thread came free, it measured roughly a handspan and a half. The lining opened like a pocket. Inside there wasn't a contract. There wasn't a will. There was no money, no jewelry, no letter. There were 3 small pieces of paper torn from a notebook, folded into quarters, yellowed along the creases, and covered in the handwriting of a woman accustomed to writing numbers. Small, even, aligned neatly in rows. with the number 7 crossed through the middle in the style people had been taught when she was a girl. The first sheet contained a long sequence of numbers divided into groups, the kind of numbers used for archival file references, accompanied by 2 abbreviations Marin didn't understand. The second listed the name of a notary office on the south side of the city, a street name, a building number, and beneath them, the name of a person, followed by a title, underlined twice. The third contained only 3 lines, the name of a bank, a short number, and the name of a woman Marin read again and again, certain that she'd never once heard anyone in this house mention it, not at dinner, not in the records, not beneath any photograph hanging along the staircase. She sat motionless with the 3 slips of paper spread across the table beneath the lamp, and she understood something that turned both her hands cold. That woman hadn't hidden the evidence inside the lining of her cardigan. She had hidden the map that led to the evidence. She went on her day off, taking the bus, getting off 2 stops later, then walking several more blocks to the notary office on the south side of the city, whose name appeared on the second slip of paper. A narrow office in a 2-story building, wedged between a laundromat and a pharmacy, with lettering on the glass door that had peeled halfway away. The woman at the counter listened as Marin read out the sequence of numbers, typed it into the computer, then looked up and said that the paper archives from those years no longer existed. There had been an incident in the basement several years earlier. Water first, then a small fire in the storage area, and according to the official report, all the file boxes from that period had been destroyed. Marin asked whether there were scanned copies. The woman said records from that period hadn't yet been digitized. Marin asked who had been in charge of the archives back then, and read aloud the name that had been underlined twice on the paper. The woman looked at her a little longer than necessary, then said that he had left the job and moved out of the city a long time ago, and no, they didn't keep contact addresses for former employees. Marin thanked her, went outside, and stood at the bus stop, waiting for the ride home, without being able to think anything through clearly. 3 days later, a nurse from the old center where Marin used to work sent her a message asking whether she was applying for a job somewhere, because a man had come by asking about her, asking how long she'd worked there, asking whether she moved often, asking very politely, dressed well, and leaving no name. That evening in the kitchen, Marin told Elias about it in her ordinary voice, one hand still stirring the pot, mentioning it between a comment about how the bedroom door hinge had been oiled and was somehow still squeaking. Elias was standing at the far end of the stone counter, holding the small spoon he used to test the consistency. He set the spoon down on the stone, very gently, and walked into the hallway. The kitchen door didn't close all the way. Marin heard him make a call. Then there was silence for several beats. Then his voice, low, no louder than the voice he used when asking about the weather, came through the gap in the door and said exactly 4 words. "I want the name." After that, there was nothing else. No second sentence, no goodbye, only the sound of him ending the call, and his footsteps heading toward the front door. Marin remained in the kitchen with the spoon in her hand, and the porridge barely simmering at the bottom of the pot. And she stood there for a very long time. She had seen that man sitting on the wooden floor with his back against the side of the bed, both hands resting on his knees, unable to speak a single word. She had seen that man carrying a tray down the hallway every morning and asking her whether it was 2 spoonfuls or 3 spoonfuls of thickening powder. And she had just heard that same man say 4 words out there. For months, she had told herself that they were 2 different men, that there was one man in daylight and another after dark. And that evening, standing in the brightly lit kitchen, she understood that they weren't. There was only one man, and she was going to have to live with knowing that. She worked the night shift at the center downtown that evening. By the time she came out into the parking lot, it was well past midnight, and the lot was almost empty, with only her car and the security guard's pickup truck at the far corner, the overhead lights casting separate pools of brightness across the pavement. She walked toward her car, took out her keys, and then stopped. On the hood, placed neatly in the exact center, its 2 edges parallel with the edges of the hood, was her hardbound notebook. The notebook she'd searched her entire room for 2 days earlier, and had finally decided she must have left somewhere in the house. It was dry. It was clean. There was no note tucked inside, no additional writing, not a single page torn out. She picked it up and turned, looking across the entire parking lot. There was no one there. No engine running, no headlights pulling away, no figure standing near the exit. She opened the car door, got into the driver's seat, locked the doors, placed the notebook on her lap, and sat there without moving until her hands stopped trembling enough for her to put the key into the ignition. The box of photographs was kept in the low cabinet in the small sitting room, a square tin box that had once held cookies, and Estelle said Marin could simply take it, because no one had opened it in years. Marin carried it into the room that afternoon, when the sun had dropped low enough to pass through the window in a horizontal band across the blanket, and she lifted the lid and set the box on Adelaide's lap. She gave no instructions. She simply sat on the left side, a little lower than Adelaide, and talked about how the wind wasn't as strong that day. Adelaide picked up the photograph on top. She looked at it for about 3 breaths, then placed it on the blanket. She picked up the second photograph, looked at it, set it down. She continued with the steady rhythm of someone dealing cards, neither fast nor slow, and Marin watched each picture pass through her hands. Someone's wedding on the steps of a church, an old car parked outside the iron gate, 2 women in wide-brimmed hats standing beside the fountain back when it still held water. A long dinner table with more than 20 people seated around it, a boy of 5 or 6 wearing an oversized coat and standing beside this very house. Adelaide didn't pause at any of them. Then there was a photograph of that same boy when he was older, perhaps 13 or 14, standing beside a boat with his hair tousled and smiling wide enough to show his teeth. She looked at it for exactly as long as she had looked at the others and put it down. Marin said nothing. The next photograph had been taken in the dining room during some season when there were flowers on the table. 9 or 10 people standing in a row behind the long table, everyone holding a glass, everyone looking toward the camera. Adelaide picked up that photograph and didn't put it down. Her hand began to tremble very slightly along the edge. She raised it closer to her eyes. Then she extended the index finger of her right hand and placed it over one face in the back row. On the left, a man whose hair was still dark, standing slightly behind the shoulder of the person beside him, holding a glass at chest level. She didn't tap the photograph. She didn't move her finger. She simply rested it there and held it still. And she held it there for a very long time, longer than she had done anything with any photograph before it. Then she let the picture fall onto the blanket, reached her left hand toward the back of the chair, and stroked the hem of the gray wool cardigan with the pad of her thumb, moving from the inside outward, in that same rhythm, over that same exact place. Then she began again. She picked up the photograph, placed her finger over that face, held it there, then let it go and stroked the hem of the cardigan. Then again, Marin couldn't remember when she had left the chair. She only realized that she was sitting on the wooden floor, with her back against the side of the bed, the photograph in her hand, staring at the face of the man in the back row on the left, the face of the man who still came to this house for dinner, the man whose elegant slanting signature appeared at the bottom of a 9-item notice pinned beside the kitchen door, the man she had passed in the hallway more times than she could count, and had always greeted with a polite nod. She thought about the hardbound notebook, about the 2 lines written 19 days apart. She thought about the 3 small pieces of paper sewn into the lining with the same basting stitch those hands still remembered how to make. She thought about the motion of stroking the hem of the cardigan, the motion she had written in her handover notes as purposeless, repetitive behavior, with instructions that the attachment object should remain in its usual place. That woman hadn't forgotten. That woman had stored the answer in the one place no one could take away from her. And then dozens of times every day, for 3 straight years, she had pointed to that exact place for anyone who entered the room. And for 3 straight years, no one had stayed long enough to look. Sloane Ashworth came back one afternoon without warning, drove herself to the house, rang the bell herself. And when Estelle opened the door, Sloane said she wanted to see Marin Doyle, not the master of the house. They sat in the small sitting room, the one with the low cabinet that held the box of photographs, and Sloane didn't take off her coat. She placed a white envelope on the table, pushed it toward the center, and said the money inside was hers, not her father's, and that it was enough to pay 4 years of tuition for Marin's younger brother, with money left over to help Marin get settled somewhere else. And the condition was that she leave before the end of the month and have no contact with anyone in this house for 2 years. Sloane said it in the voice of someone who had practiced the sentence in the car. Marin looked at the envelope and didn't touch it. She asked how Sloane knew about her brother. Sloane said she'd asked the housekeeper, and the housekeeper hadn't told her. Then she'd asked the woman who cleaned the staircase, and that woman had. Then Sloane added that she knew what that made her. She knew exactly what kind of person it made her, and she was her father's daughter. Marin let the silence sit between them for a long while, before saying that she'd been paid for the work she did since she was 15 years old, that she saw nothing shameful in being paid for work, but she wasn't going to start accepting money for who she was. Sloane didn't argue. She picked up the envelope, slipped it back into her handbag, and that was when everything changed. She said that the truth was, she hadn't come there because of that. Or not only because of that, and that she'd sat in her car outside the gate for nearly an hour before finally ringing the bell. Then she told her Her father's company had been the concrete contractor for a large project on the south side, a data center, and the foundations had been completed the previous season. She worked in project development. She had signed off on the foundation drawings. Included in the supporting documents was a parcel extract showing the name of the landowner, and she'd read it, and the name on that document wasn't the name that should have been there. She said that at the time she'd stopped for exactly 3 seconds, then turned to the next page. Marin asked why. She said that back when she was still his public fiancé, before his family's trust terms forced the secret arrangement with Marin, she believed she was about to become the mistress of this house, and people didn't burn down the house they were preparing to move into. She said it very calmly, without defending herself and without lowering her voice. Then she said that now she wasn't buying anymore, so she was telling her. The following evening, Everett Ashworth came to the house alone, bringing no one with him, and he stayed in the study with Elias for 2 hours. No one knew what was said inside. What they did know was that when the door opened, the engagement was over, and it ended not because of the man inside that room, but because of his daughter. Everett walked into the foyer, took his hat from Estelle, put it on, and said one sentence loudly enough for both Estelle and Walt, who was standing at the foot of the staircase, to hear clearly. "You treated my daughter more kindly than I did, and I won't forgive you for that anytime soon." Then he went out to his car. He never stepped inside that house again. 3 days later, Harold Ledbetter called, and the old man's voice over the telephone sounded like the voice of someone reading laboratory results. The deadline had passed. The clause had been triggered. The trust was closed permanently and couldn't be reopened by any means. And all real estate held in the family name would be placed on the market, with the process beginning the following week. And in his experience, it usually took about 4 weeks from the time a property was listed until someone arrived to take measurements and photographs. Elias put down the phone and stood motionless in the hallway for a while. Then he went upstairs to the north wing, because it was time for the evening meal, and Marin was waiting in the kitchen with the tray. The woman's name on the third sheet of paper turned out to be the maiden name of Adelaide's biological mother, a seamstress from Bridgeport who had been dead for many years, a name no one in this house had spoken aloud even once during Adelaide's 26 years there. It took Ledbetter 3 days to trace that much, and another 2 to receive the answer he had expected from the beginning. The safe deposit box was registered in the name of the deceased woman, and the only heir designated to access it was Adelaide Corvino. No power of attorney had ever been prepared. No other document could substitute for it. No court order could be obtained within 4 weeks. Ledbetter said plainly over the telephone that he had tried 3 different routes, and all 3 were closed, and that the bank would open the box if the owner appeared in person and signed, and only then. Elias asked him once more to be certain. Ledbetter repeated it once more. The only person in the world who could open that box was the woman who couldn't remember her own name. They went on a morning washed in pale sunlight. Marin dressed Adelaide in a heavy sweater, then put the gray cardigan over it, and Adelaide didn't resist, because Marin had spent the previous 3 mornings getting her accustomed to wearing it, a little at a time, exactly the way people prepare someone for something that is going to happen. Walt drove. In the car, Marin sat to Adelaide's left and talked the entire way, never asking a question, simply talking about the neighbor's gate, whose paint hadn't dried, about the dog that kept squeezing through the gap beneath the fence, and then squeezing back again, about how they had nailed another board across it and the dog had still found a way through. The bank occupied an old building with high ceilings and terrazzo floors, and footsteps echoed there in the kind of way that made people naturally begin walking more softly. They were taken into a room at the back, with a long table, 3 men in suits, and a uniformed security guard standing at the door. Ledbetter was already seated there with his file case open. Adelaide stopped at the threshold. She looked at the high ceiling, looked at the strangers, and both hands searched for the hem of her cardigan. Marin didn't pull her forward. She moved around to the left, sat down on a low chair she had asked them to bring in beforehand, settling slightly below Adelaide's eye level. And she continued the story she had left unfinished in the car, using the same voice and the same rhythm, saying that in the end they had to drive 2 more stakes into the ground. And the dog sat on the other side of the fence staring across for the entire afternoon. Adelaide stopped clutching the hem. She allowed Marin to guide her to the table and sit her down. One of the men in suits began reading the procedure aloud, reading very quickly, and Ledbetter raised a hand to signal for him to slow down. They placed the document in front of Adelaide, turned it the right way, and laid a pen beside it. She didn't pick up the pen. She looked at the paper as though it were nothing more than a tablecloth. Someone behind them cleared his throat. Elias stood at the far end of the room against the wall, both arms hanging at his sides, and he didn't step forward. didn't say a word, didn't touch anything. Maren picked up the pen. She didn't bring it in from directly in front of Adelaide's face. She brought it slowly from the left, allowing her hand to enter Adelaide's field of vision before it came close, and she kept talking about the dog, about how one ear flopped down while the other stood upright, about how it had stayed there for a very long time, before finally wandering away. She placed the pen into Adelaide's hand, thumb first, then index finger, then closed the remaining fingers around it, exactly the way someone would place a needle into the hand of a person who sewed. Then Maren slipped her own hand underneath and supported Adelaide's wrist, not gripping, not pushing, only supporting. The entire room went silent. The man in the suit stopped reading. The security guard at the door didn't shift his weight. Adelaide looked down at the paper. She straightened slightly, the smallest movement through her shoulders, the movement of someone about to do the work she had done every evening for 26 years before closing the books. Then her wrist turned. It wasn't Maren turning it, because Maren was only supporting her. It turned according to its own remembered rhythm, and the tip of the pen touched the paper, and that hand began to move. It moved in one continuous motion, without hesitation anywhere. The upward stroke, the downward stroke, the loop in the middle, the long final line that she had always carried a little farther than necessary. Then it stopped and lifted the pen from the page. Adelaide set the pen down on the table. Then she looked up at Maren without recognizing anyone at all, and reached her left hand over to stroke the hem of her cardigan. Ledbetter bent over the paper and studied it for a very long time. Then he opened his case, took out another sheet, one already yellowed with age, placed it beside the first, and compared the two signatures beneath the desk lamp. He said nothing for a while, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. He told the man in the suit that it was enough. At the far end of the room, Elias remained exactly where he was, and he didn't leave until they had helped Adelaide away from the table. The safe deposit box was in the bank's basement, inside a room lined with steel and smelling of dry paper, and they were left alone there after 2 keys had been inserted, and the long metal box had been pulled from its compartment. Ledbetter set the box on the table and stepped back. Elias lifted the lid. On top was a bundle of documents tied with cloth ribbon, and Ledbetter pulled it out, untied it, and read for perhaps half a minute before lowering himself into a chair, without looking to see where the chair was. He said this was the original, complete, notarized, numbered, and that it didn't say the land on the south side had been sold at all. It said the land had been leased. The term was 60 years. He turned another page and read the expiration date aloud, then looked up at Elias and said that date had passed in the spring of this year. He added that for 30 years, a small amount of money had been flowing steadily into the family accounts every month under an entry no one had ever bothered to question, and now he knew what that money was. Elias didn't answer. He was looking at what lay beneath the documents. It was an ivory-colored envelope, yellowed along all 4 edges, still unopened, the seal unbroken, and on the front was a single handwritten line in faded blue ink naming the recipient as Frank Doyle. There was no address, no stamp, nothing else. Elias picked it up and held it in both hands, and he didn't open it. He stared at that name for a very long time. The name he had first heard one morning in the kitchen from the woman who cooked porridge for his mother. The name of a man who had gone out to deliver an envelope on a winter night and never reached his destination. The envelope was here. It hadn't reached its destination because it had never left this house. Beneath that, near the bottom of the box, was a sheet of paper folded in half, letterhead printed across the top, and Elias recognized the handwriting the moment he opened it because it was his grandfather's handwriting, the same hand he had seen at the bottom of birthday cards throughout his childhood. It was a letter written to his mother in the final weeks, written with a trembling hand, and he had once heard part of it read aloud when he was 14, beside the sickbed, the part that said that Doyle blood was yours to look after. He had never read the rest. The rest was written across the lower half of the page, and it said that a man had died because of work done for me, and that you mustn't send money to his family. Never. Because money is what we give to people whose faces we don't have the courage to look at. It said go there, stand at their door, and say with your own mouth what needs to be said. It said that I couldn't do it, and I carry that with me, and at the end of that sentence were exactly 3 words. Don't be me. Elias stood in that steel-lined room beneath the bank with the sheet of paper in his hands, and he read that passage again, then again, 19 years. For 19 years he had done exactly what the man who wrote those words had forbidden him to do, and he had done it believing that he was keeping a promise. Ledbetter rose and came to the table. He picked up the land documents, turned to the last page, then to the section containing the appendices, and read silently. And then he stopped. He placed one finger on a line, and turned the papers around so Elias could see. It was a list of the people authorized to access the original document, and there were 3 names. The first was his grandfather. The second was his mother. The third belonged to the person who had signed as a witness, and beside that signature was a date. And that date fell within the exact week Elias had remembered down to each individual day for the past 3 years. The week before that afternoon, before the follow-up appointment, before he handed the keys to his own car to a 31-year-old man. Ledbetter said nothing. Elias read the third name. Then, he set the documents down on the table very gently, and he stood there staring at them. And in that steel-lined room, there was no sound except the steady hum of the ventilation fan overhead. It happened that night. The night the entire house went to bed late, and no one managed to sleep. And it began with something Maren had been watching for so many months that she recognized it before she was fully awake. The breathing. Not snoring. Not coughing. It was the thin wheeze at the end of every breath. The sound of an airway working too hard. The kind of sound people in her profession learned to hear before they heard anything else. She ran down the hallway barefoot. Adelaide was propped against the pillows, leaning forward, both shoulders lifting with every breath, the edges of her lips already turning faintly gray, the skin above her breastbone drawing inward each time she inhaled. Maren brought her fully upright, opened the window, called her by name, and received no response. And she knew exactly what this was. The thing she had written into the handover notes during her very first week as a risk that had to be watched. The thing every spoonful of porridge had been counted through 4 beats for all these months in order to prevent. She called an ambulance. It arrived faster than she had feared. She climbed in with Adelaide, one hand holding the tray of tubing, and while the paramedic fitted the oxygen line over Adelaide's ears, Maren pulled out her phone to call the house, and the screen went black. She had plugged it in that afternoon and remembered clearly that she had. But the outlet beside her bed had been loose since the previous season, and 3 times she had meant to tell Walt, and all 3 times she had forgotten. She borrowed the paramedic's phone and called the house number, and no one answered, because the only landline that still worked was in the dining room on the 1st floor, and at night there was no one there. Back at the house, Elias woke because of the sound of the ambulance. By the time he reached the foyer, the taillights were already disappearing beyond the gate. Estelle stood at the foot of the staircase, still holding her robe closed, and she said she hadn't heard which hospital they were going to. He called Maren. Her phone was off. He called again. Still off. Walt had gone to his daughter's house that afternoon because the next day was his grandchild's birthday, and he wouldn't be back before noon. In that house, at that hour, there was no driver. There was no one. Elias stood in the middle of the foyer with the phone in his hand, and then he went out to the garage. He switched on the single bulb that still burned at the far end. 6 cars sat beneath covers folded square at all 4 corners, threaded with cords and tied tight. The 7th sat beneath the crooked cover, one corner touching the floor, dust lying so thick across the fabric that the handprint of the person who had covered it and never returned was still visible. Elias stood in front of it for a long time. Then he took hold of the edge of the cover and pulled. Dust rose into the cone of light, and underneath was the black paint, still intact, the plated door handle, and on the windshield, a faint hand-shaped smear left there by someone 3 years earlier. He opened the door. Inside was the smell of leather no one had sat on for a long time, and the smell of dry dust. The key was in the compartment, exactly where it had always been. He sat down in the driver's seat and placed both hands on the steering wheel. He didn't start the engine. He sat there motionless in the darkness of the garage, both hands still resting on the wheel, and he sat for a very long time, long enough for the bulb at the far end to begin making the faint sound it always made when it had been burning too long. For 3 years he hadn't done this, not because he was afraid of the road, not because his hands had forgotten, but because there had been an afternoon when he had stood in this exact place holding the keys to this exact car, and he had handed them to someone else instead of going himself. He thought about the unopened ivory envelope lying in the safe deposit box beneath the bank. He thought about the 3 words at the end of a letter written in a trembling hand. Then he put the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine started on the first try, low and steady, as though it had only been waiting. He backed out of the garage, turned on the gravel, and drove through the gate. Rain was falling outside, not hard, but persistent, the kind of night rain that seemed determined to continue, and the windshield wipers swept across the glass in 2 even arcs. He drove through the neighborhood, down to the main road, onto the city expressway, and the streetlights began sliding across the windshield in yellow streaks, one after another, evenly spaced. He passed the turn he had avoided for 3 years by telling Walt to take another route. He didn't slow down there. He didn't speed up either. He simply drove past it, both hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead, and continued for more than a dozen blocks until he saw the red emergency room sign glowing against the rain-darkened wall. Adelaide stayed in the hospital for 4 days before they brought her home, breathing better, thinner than before, and she returned to her old room with a new humidifier standing in the corner, and on the 6th day Elias called a meeting. No one was told in advance what it was about. They came that evening, 11 men, and they sat around that same long table in the dining room, except there was no food laid out, only water and coffee. And that alone said something. Arthur Mercer sat where he always sat, on the right side, 2 seats down from the head of the table, one hand resting on the leather briefcase standing beside his chair, and he was the only man in the room who still asked whether the lady of the house had managed to eat. Elias said that she had. Then he stood. He walked to the head of the table, carrying a heavy paper bag, and he didn't begin with any words at all. He took out the first thing and placed it on the wood, the bundle of land documents tied with cloth ribbon, the ribbon already removed, the papers open to the page bearing the seal, and he turned it so the man nearest him could read it. He waited while the documents traveled all the way around the table. No one spoke. Some read carefully. Some only looked at the seal before passing the pages along. But every man picked them up. When the documents returned to the head of the table, Elias took out the second thing. It was the ivory-colored envelope, yellowed along all 4 edges, its seal still intact, and he laid it face up so everyone at the table could see the faded blue ink naming the person it had been meant for. He didn't say the name aloud. He didn't have to. Somewhere near the middle of the table, a man quietly pushed his chair back half a handspan. Then Elias took out the third thing, and this was what made the room truly silent. He laid an old gray wool cardigan on the table, neatly folded, and he folded it in such a way that the lower hem on the left front side faced upward, the place where the stitching had been removed, where the lining opened into an empty pocket. He smoothed it flat with his palm once, then took his hand away. The 3 things lay beside one another on the dark oak beneath the chandelier. Elias looked at them for a while as though he too were seeing them for the first time. Then he raised his head and addressed the entire table. He didn't look toward the right side. He said that Uncle Arthur had been the man who taught him how to tie a necktie when he was 11 years old, upstairs in the dressing room, and had taught him again and again over 3 separate afternoons, because Elias had been slow to learn. He said that Uncle Arthur had been the man standing beside him when they buried his father, standing on his left, holding his elbow throughout the lowering of the coffin, because Elias hadn't been able to remain steady on his feet that day. He said he wanted everyone sitting there to know those 2 things clearly, to know them now, so that afterward no one would walk out into the world and say that he had done what he was about to do easily. Then he returned to his place, pulled out his chair, sat down, and didn't say another word. No one asked a question. No one demanded an explanation. In the line of work all of them had spent their lives in, explanations weren't necessary once those 3 things were lying side by side on a table. The man seated at the far left end was the first to stand. He didn't say goodbye, didn't look at anyone, simply took his coat from the back of his chair and walked out. Then 2 men near the middle of the table stood at the same time and followed him. Then the youngest man in the room, the one Mercer had brought in 2 years earlier, stood, pushed his chair neatly back against the edge of the table, and left. After that, the rest began to rise, not all at once, each man leaving a beat after the one before him, enough distance between them that no one could ever say he had merely followed the crowd. Footsteps crossed the marble floor in the foyer. A door opened, a door closed, an engine started on the gravel drive, then another engine after it. 2 men remained in the dining room. Arthur Mercer was still seated. He didn't reach for any of the 3 objects. He looked at them, then lowered his eyes to the tabletop in front of his water glass, and he remained that way for a very long time, while the chandelier cast light over him and the leather briefcase beside his chair threw a long shadow across the floor. Elias sat at the head of the table and watched him. He said nothing. He didn't stand. He didn't call anyone into the room. He simply sat there and watched, and he kept watching until the other man reached down for the briefcase himself, pushed back his own chair, rose on his own, and walked to the door by himself. No one touched him. No one needed to. The small house at the far end of the property had a fireplace that burned through all 4 seasons, and Constance Corvino sat there with a blanket over her knees, 78 years old, turning 2 rings that had grown loose around her fingers. And when Elias came in, she didn't ask what he wanted. She simply tilted her chin toward the chair across from her and said, "Don't sit in that one. The back leg is broken. I'm saving it for the minister." He sat down and placed a receipt folded into quarters on the table between them. Something Ledbetter had found tucked into the bank records. A notice for the annual safe deposit box fee, 3 consecutive years, paid in full, with the payer's name written clearly. She looked at it and didn't pretend to be surprised for even a second. She said yes, that was me. He asked what else there was. She said the nurse. She said that 3 years earlier, 3 nursing homes had sent solicitation letters to this house, and I burned all 3. That the person in charge of personnel at the family company had been mine since your father's time. That the application file ended up on top of the stack for a reason, not by chance, and that I had been looking for that surname for 3 years. Elias asked why that family. She said because everyone in this house draws a salary from someone, and I needed someone whose loyalty couldn't be bought by a paycheck. And in this whole city there was only one family left that owed the Corvinos something money couldn't repay. She went on to say that I didn't know what she would find. I only knew she would be willing to sit in that room. Elias sat in silence for a while, then asked the question he had come there to ask. He asked why she hadn't told him sooner. He asked how she could sit in this house for 3 years watching him, knowing, and say nothing. She didn't answer right away. She poured more liquor into the small glass with a trembling hand, and didn't spill a single drop. Set the bottle down, then looked directly into his face. She said, because if I'd told you 3 years ago, you would have handled it with your hands. She said you would have gone looking for him that same night. And you know you would have gone. And I knew it too. And I've watched you grow since before you were old enough to wear long pants, so I knew it more certainly than you did. She said then you would have gone to prison. Not for 2 years, but for the rest of your life. And while you were sitting in there, your mother would have been sent to a place with hallways lit all night, and the smell of bleach in the air, and they would have fed her in whatever way was fastest, and she would have been gone within half a year, and the paperwork would have said, respiratory complications. She didn't emphasize a single word of it. Then she said that's why I waited. She said I needed you to find him, after you'd learned how to sit in that room for 40 minutes every morning, because a man who can sit for 40 minutes every morning with someone who can't remember his name is already a different man. She said only then would you handle this with papers. Elias looked down at the blanket over her knees. He asked whether she had ever thought about the fact that she'd let him condemn himself for 3 years. She said yes. I thought about it every night. Then she lifted the glass, took a sip, set it down, and said the rest. I didn't save your mother, son. She was always going to end up this way. I knew that from the beginning. She looked into the fire. I saved you. Marin left anyway, because the contract had never been cancelled on paper, and she was not the kind of person who stayed somewhere when her standing there was no longer clear, and she had handed Estelle her resignation the week before. Written by hand, 2 lines, no explanation. Walt drove her to the bus station in one of the family's old cars, with her suitcase and a cardboard box tied with string on the back seat. When they reached the wooden fence near the road, he had to brake because a red knit cap was running along the other side of the fence, and a school bag was bouncing against someone's back. Milo Briggs crawled through the gap beneath the fence, stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and came to the car door breathing hard. The boy asked if she was really leaving. She said yes. He thought for a moment, then asked who was going to make Adelaide's porridge. Marin said Uncle Elias would make it, that he'd been making it since spring, and Walt would make sure he didn't put in too much water. The boy considered this with great seriousness. His eyes lowered toward the toes of his shoes, and he considered it much longer than an ordinary question deserved, then gave one nod, apparently satisfied with the arrangement, and held out his hand to shake hers, because someone had taught him that this was how people said goodbye. Marin shook his hand. The boy said that if she came back, he would read her the new book, the one with the submarine. Then he climbed back through the fence. They had gone about 2 miles farther when Walt began to speak, without looking over, his eyes still on the road ahead. He said that the previous Tuesday the young master had gone down to Cicero, hauled lumber in the back of the truck himself. They came to the door, and he told them he'd come to apologize, and they stood there looking at him for a while, then went back inside. Walt shifted gears on the incline. He said they came back out and handed him a hammer, then told him that if he'd come to repair the porch roof, he ought to repair it, and the coffee was in the kitchen. Walt said Elias worked from morning until dark, never went inside the house once. At noon he sat on the front steps and ate like a laborer. Walt fell silent for a while, then added that when Elias was leaving, they poured him a cup of coffee, and he drank it standing in the yard, and they went back into the kitchen and stood there for a very long time. Marin said nothing. She looked out through the window for the rest of the ride. She rented a room on the 2nd floor of an old building on Archer Street, above a laundromat, a room barely 3 steps wide, with a table beneath the window and a 2-burner electric stove. She took the night shift at a nursing center in Bridgeport, starting Monday. On Wednesday evening, The owner of the laundromat called up the stairs that someone was asking for her, and she heard footsteps coming up. And then Elias had to lower his head to pass through the doorway because the door frames in that building were low. He stood there with rainwater still running from the shoulders of his coat onto the wooden floor, and in his hand was a bound packet of papers, and she knew immediately what it was. He opened his mouth to speak. She held out her hand. "Give it to me," she said. He did. She took the papers, turned to the last page, looked at her own signature there, then folded the entire packet in half and tore it. The paper was thick, so she had to tear it twice, and the sound was very loud in that small room. She placed the two halves on the edge of the table. Then she said, "I'm not signing this again. I'm not signing anything like it, and I'm not signing some version where a few lines have been changed. For 7 months, you've handed me papers, and I've read them, and I've signed them, because that was the only way anyone ever spoke to me." She looked at him. "Now, if you want something, ask me," she said. "Ask me the way you ask a human being." Elias stood motionless. He had stood in rooms full of men, and never needed more than 2 sentences. He had sat at the head of a long table and needed no words at all. And now he was standing in a room barely 3 steps wide, empty-handed, rain dripping onto the floor, and he didn't know where to begin. He managed 1 word, then stopped. He tried again. He said, "I don't have anything to say this with." He said that people were coming to measure the house the following week, and every other man who said what he was about to say had a house in which to say it, while all he had was a garage, a woman who couldn't remember his name, and a wool cardigan with the stitches taken out of the hem. Then he drew a breath, and he asked. They were married in the little church in Cicero, the red brick church whose front steps had settled slightly on the left side, on a cold, late autumn morning beneath a high, clear sky, and there were 14 people inside. Ledbetter came wearing the same suit he wore to funerals because he didn't own another one. Walt came clean-shaven, and he kept reaching up to adjust his tie because his hands could no longer tie the knot, so Estelle had done it for him and had pulled it a little too tight. Constance sat in the front row on the left with her cane propped against the pew, and she had announced beforehand that she wasn't going to cry, and she kept that promise until nearly the end. Owen flew home from school wearing a coat he had borrowed from someone, stood beside his sister, and didn't say a word because he had never been a man of many words. Delia Briggs, Nolan's widow, served as a witness, signing the paper in the round, clear handwriting of someone who had once worked as a secretary, holding the pen with the steady hand of a woman who had finally forgiven the past. Milo was entrusted with the ring box. The boy had asked 3 times beforehand exactly where he was supposed to stand and when he was supposed to bring it forward, and he had practiced at home with a candy box. And that morning he stood at the head of the aisle between the 2 rows of pews, holding the box in both open palms, his back straight, his eyes forward, as solemn as though someone had entrusted him with a matter concerning the entire state. When his turn came, he walked forward the exact number of steps, held out the box, and opened the lid with his thumb exactly the way he had practiced. And when Elias took out the ring, Milo let out a breath so loud that the whole church heard it. And the whole church laughed. And he laughed too. Adelaide sat in the front row on the right in her wheelchair, with an extra firm cushion behind her back, wearing a heavy sweater with the gray cardigan over it. Marin carried no flowers. In her hands she held a white cloth handkerchief edged with white thread, a small old handkerchief, and along its border ran a line of basting stitches, each one spaced so evenly that a ruler laid across them would have found no variation. And inside that church only 2 people knew where those stitches had been finished, and on what afternoon. The ceremony was short. There was no music, only the sound of wind beyond the doors and, halfway through, the sound of a truck passing along the main road outside. When it was over, everyone went out onto the steps for photographs, and Walt wheeled Adelaide down the side ramp, and Elias came over and lowered himself onto one knee on the left side of her chair, so that his face was level with hers, exactly the way he had learned to do one spring morning on the wooden floor of the room at the end of the hallway. He said nothing. He simply rested one hand on the arm of the chair. Adelaide looked at him. She looked for a very long time, longer than she had looked at anyone in 3 years, long enough that Walt stopped behind the chair and Marin, halfway down the steps, stopped where she was. Nothing changed in Adelaide's eyes. Nothing brightened there. Nothing came back. And it wasn't the kind of moment people tell stories about in movies. She only looked. Then she raised her right hand, the hand that had threaded a needle and signed a long signature beneath a desk lamp in a room lined with steel, and placed it on his wrist. She didn't grip him. She simply rested her hand there, the way someone might place a hand on a child's wrist to tell him to sit still for a moment. And then she called him. She managed exactly 1 word. short and rough, the breath failing at the end. The childhood name that only 2 people in the world had ever used for him, and one of those 2 had been in the ground for a long time. Elias didn't move. He lowered his head until his forehead nearly touched the back of her hand, and he stayed that way. And no one on those church steps said a single word. Only once. Never again. Adelaide Corvino passed away on a winter night the following year, in her sleep, in the same room at the end of the North Wing corridor, after an evening bowl of porridge that her son had cooked and carried in himself. They buried her in the cemetery on the hill north of the city, beside her mother, the seamstress from Bridgeport, whose name no one in that house had spoken aloud for so many years. The land on the south side returned to the family after 7 months of litigation, which Ledbetter called the easiest 7 months of his 40 years practicing law, because, as he said, when the papers are right, all that remains is patience. The house was removed from the sales list before anyone ever arrived to measure it. Arthur Mercer moved to another state to live with his daughter, and no one in that city ever heard his name mentioned again. And in their world, that was the harshest punishment that could be handed down to a man. Owen Doyle graduated as an engineer, and now works on the structural calculations for a bridge crossing a river in Ohio, and he has never thanked anyone for anything in his life, which his sister says is the surest sign that he is happy. 2 years later, Sloane Ashworth married a pediatrician in Portland, an ordinary man who had gone bald early and called her every night whenever work took him away from home. And Constance Corvino lived to be 91, and still said it was the most decently arranged marriage she had ever heard of, and she said it without a trace of irony. The white handkerchief edged in white thread was kept in the top drawer of the table beneath the window in the north-facing room. And it is still there. There are debts in this world that can't be repaid with money, debts that can only be paid by being there, by walking through the door you've spent years avoiding and sitting down beside the person you've hurt. And a human being, even after forgetting every name, even after losing the ability to feed herself, even after no longer knowing where she is still a human being, not a line of expense on a 9-item cost-cutting notice. Down at the harbor on the south side, people still lower their voices when they say the name Elias Corvino. They still tell the story of the warehouse and the 3 stapled pages, and the story of the long table where an entire room rose and walked away, and not one of them knows that before dawn, that same man was sitting on a low chair in the room at the end of the hallway, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, silently counting 4 beats between every spoonful. The pot still has to go on the stove 20 minutes early. And now there are 2 people who put it there. If this story has touched something inside your heart, please leave a like, share it with the person who came to mind while you were listening, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, which moment made you linger the longest, and what you think about the debts that money can never repay. So please leave a comment and let us hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always have good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next story.